Hello and welcome to the GlobalChurch Project. I'm Graham Hill. Kevin Doi is the founding pastor of Epic Church, which was planted out of a Japanese-American church in California. He's co-founder of JOYA Scholars, a not-for-profit organisation helping young people achieve their educational goals. Kevin Doi is an adjunct professor at the Asian American Institute at Fuller Seminary in California. He's a highly regarded church planter and a contributing author of Starting Missional Churches. He helps churches explore the power of diversity, inclusion, location, meals, and deep, long-lasting relationships. Kevin Doi, welcome to the GlobalChurch Project.
Thanks for having me.
You're the founding pastor of Epic Church. Can you tell me something about when that church was planted and what the original vision for that church was?
Yeah, we were technically planted in, 1998, I think. And we were a satellite from our mother church and a church plant that I actually helped start. So kind of the combination of two churches. We were predominantly in kind of a Pan-Asian, Asian American church. And during that time, we were really hoping to reach a kind of urban postmodern person for which I think the church at that time, there weren't too many spaces for those kind of folks. What we back then would term a Gen Xer. And so that's kind of how we started, and that was kind of the vision to reach out to folks like that, folks like us. Yeah.
It was originally an Asian American church, but there's been a shift in the makeup of the community over time.
Yeah, and so one of the significant things is 3 years into our church plant, we ended up in a city called Fullerton, which is where we are now. And we really felt convicted, as I mentioned, we began by, I think, attempting to reach a type of person. And we really felt convicted that we needed to embrace and love a place. And because we were in Fullerton, we said, well, maybe God's led us to this city. And so we moved really from the border of Fullerton to downtown, to literally the center of the city. And once that became home for us, and once we were committed to loving our city, we noticed a slow change in demographics. The homogenization was beginning to loosen a little bit. And we began to reach people in the area. People literally began to walk to our church from the neighborhood. And so the diversity just began to increase from there.
Can you tell me something about the neighborhood of Fullerton?
Yeah, Fullerton is an interesting city. It's an older city in Orange County, California. It actually has a downtown that's very vibrant. Probably a couple decades ago was mostly kind of antique stores, this kind of thing, but there's been some gentrifications, very kind of hip place now. And so there's a kind of urban core with a lot of nightlife, train station, museums, art, that kind of thing. And then as you move away from there, it gets a little bit more suburban. But the other interesting thing about Fullerton is that there's about three areas of our city in which very low income, lots of different needs. And so we're physically located corporately in downtown, and we do ministry in the neighborhoods as well, and in particular one called Garnet.
What does Epic Church value? And what is your vision for the church as it continues to grow?
Yeah, we have three values: community, justice, and healing. And we like to think of ourselves as kind of a Trinitarian church, and so there's a sociality that I think we acknowledge that really runs through all those values. Kind of a relational value for church as a community, understanding healing as the ability to relate not only to God, to self, but to others in a way that encourages human flourishing. Same thing with justice. And so we're an American Baptist church. The pastors kind of have Anabaptist leanings. And so we really understand that church itself as a community, which in itself is a witness and an ethic in the way in which we interact, engage with community, and express ourselves in a particular place.
And you focus on the importance of location, and we've been talking earlier, and you were suggesting that that has been something of a progression in your mind, the importance of location and relationship.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you want to share something a bit how you have grown in that conviction over time?
Yeah, I think, when we started, we were kind of at the tail end of the church growth movement, and I went to Fuller Seminary, and many of my classes still had those kind of tendencies to it. And so there's a way in which target kind of audience, this whole kind of lingo, was still very prevalent, I think. And so even though we felt ourselves a little bit more resonant with kind of postmodern thinking and those kinds of things, we really started the church kind of with some very modernist assumptions of kind of a disembodied community in which place doesn't matter, or just reaching a type of person wherever they live. And I think as we began to really be convicted, I think by the Spirit of God, that place does matter, that the incarnation of Jesus matters, that where people live and where they work shapes who they are. And so if we're called to a certain place, we want to love the people in that place. And that expression of the church, both as we try to understand and shape our church around certain habits, we also believed as we engage the city that would shape us as well. And that's how we understood our discipleship. And I think we believe that God's at work not only within the church, but also outside the church in our neighborhoods and city. And so how do we discern and understand discipleship as this kind of praxis with the neighborhood? And so it's our thinking, our theology has developed over time in that kind of way. Really understanding the necessity, I think, of believing that God is up to something in our city and participating with that. That our church, I think Moltmann said it best, the Church of God doesn't have a mission. God's mission has a church. And so really trying to submit to what God is already doing among us and participating in that. So that's been a huge shift, I think, from really seeing mission kind of being initiated and originating with some kind of vision that we had versus understanding that God's already at work here and has been at work, and how do we participate in what God is doing, and that shapes the kind of church we are.
One of the challenges for the modern church is not only that it's disconnected from its neighbourhood and disembodied in some ways, but also there's always a temptation for the church to be quite shallow and superficial in its relationships and its understandings of who it is. How do you cultivate slow and deep relationships that form mission and discipleship in your church today?
Yeah. Well, I have to be honest, it's probably our biggest challenge. We're in Los Angeles, and so I'm a native Angelino, but as I talk to people who are not native to Los Angeles, it's very common for them to say that community, this is the most difficult place to find community and have community. And so we've been very intentional about the difficulty and challenge to connect in our neck of the woods, but also understanding the church is primarily relationship. And spirituality is inherently social. And so we, at one level, like our worship gatherings, we try to create intentional connections as we gather. And so we don't understand it as a worship service in which you attend something and sit there. And so when you come in, you'll find people talking to you. We purposely have a 5 to 10 minute mingle time. This is more than just passing the peace, but actually entering into conversation around coffee and food. Our sermons will often have 1 or 2 discussion questions where people literally turn their chairs around and talk with one another. We practice the Lord's table every Sunday. We'll eat together to encourage connection. And oftentimes these kind of initial connections, which are on the shallow end, often will lead to someone being invited out to lunch or to a house church. The other thing that we're moving towards is really making our house churches more central. And these are simply kind of our gathering places during the week in people's homes. Often around a meal, again, around really finding a sense of family in these places, around God's Word and these kinds of things. But again, it's to encourage a deeper level of connection. Where we deal with hypermobility and upward mobility and social fragmentation in Southern California. And so, one way to look at it is to resign ourselves to this is just how it is. But I think as a church, we are actually trying to say, I think the church is an alternative to that. And as difficult it is to choose into something different, because the inertia is so strong to simply attend church on a Sunday, for instance, not to give ourselves so much more. We really do try to encourage people. We don't think discipleship can happen any other way. There's a place for the large gathering to shape us. There's a place for us to be connected at the house church level. And we've always tried, although again, it's very difficult to encourage people to be involved long-term in some of our neighborhoods in Fullerton in terms of justice. And if not, I realize not everyone can do that. But certainly then to be intentional about where they work and where they live.
I find it interesting that you celebrate the Lord's Supper every Sunday. Not a lot of Baptist churches do that.
No.
Growing up Churches of Christ, I was used to doing that every Sunday. Okay. What's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, I think, one, it physically, it's a reminder of that Jesus is central to our community. It's the table's literally in the center. But one, it reminds us theologically that the Eucharist or the Lord's table makes the church. It's the reason Jesus' life and death and resurrection is why the church exists. And so it is an invitation every week to engage and interact and experience the presence of Jesus, that we are submitting our lives once again this week to the presence and reality of Christ in our lives. And so this is good for us as followers of Jesus. It's an invitation each week for those who are not yet convinced but are curious. Over the years, it's been really one of the ways that incrementally people who have been part of our church but not yet taken kind of that step of commitment to Christ, little by little they're invited and are able to participate. And I think what's a little bit unique about Epic is that people will participate. You have to get up out of your seats and actually go to the table. But many people will take it with other people. They'll take it with someone that they were in a discussion group with, someone sitting next to them, friend, family, house churches will often take communion together. And then we have prayer ministry, we have a cross, we have these different stations in which people can meditate. And so really it's our worship service kind of culminates in this kind of moment in which we are mindful of Jesus and what he's done for us. in response to the proclamation of the word. And we really felt like we wanted to make that central to our church, not necessarily any pastor, any sermon, but really the Eucharist.
And you've said you can tell a lot about a church by how often it eats and who it eats with as well.
Yeah. So, in the Gospels, obviously, Jesus picks up the Passover meal, and we like to say that Jesus died because of who he ate with. And so he was always being called out because of who he ate with and how he ate. But again, we find that to be a sign of fellowship and kinship. Meals are symbols and practices of hospitality, I think in a very real way, in which we invite people who are different than us to the table as a sign of friendship and inclusion. So that's our theology. It's obviously more difficult to practice that. But since we moved to downtown Fullerton over the years, there's a great diversity ethnically, socioeconomically. We've always had handful of homeless people who not just kind of wander in and out, but actually have made Epic their church. There's several homeless transitional shelters in the area. So we end up being kind of their spiritual community for the time they're in the shelters, and we're able to kind of walk with them and actually get to know them. Some have become members of our church. And so we used to encourage, back in the day, we used to encourage people after the formal worship service to actually go out to eat. And we realized that was a huge assumption we were making about the ability to do that financially. And so we began to put more and more money in our general budget actually to bring meals in. So we'll have breakfast during our worship service, or we'll just bring food in, and as soon as worship service is over, we have lunch. I know that's not unusual for a lot of ethnic churches, but so we'll do that so everyone is included. Almost everyone stays. We get into circles and have fellowship that way.
Well, that makes a lot of sense in terms of the financial burden, but also I do notice over time that when you tend to go somewhere to eat, you lose a significant percentage of people when you have that kind of process as well. You've been involved in a thing called Hoyas Scholars. Can you tell me something about that program and how it began?
We were, many of us were serving with a nonprofit, a Christian nonprofit in this one particular neighborhood of Fullerton called the Garnet Neighborhood. So I used to volunteer there after school program for many years. There was this one student, Valeria, who wanted to go to college and didn't know how to do that. And so we brought some resources around her and mentoring, these kinds of things. And as we began to do a little bit more ethnography and research in the area, in the collective memory of the neighborhood, there hadn't been a college graduate at that point in over a decade. So it's probably close to 2 decades. I think at one time it was a different kind of neighborhood, but it was a mostly low-income neighborhood now for probably a good 2 or 3 decades. And these kids went to very good schools. It's a really great school district. But no one was going to college, let alone graduate from a college. And so Hoya partnered with this other organization called Solidarity, and we basically took the educational piece. And so we began to work with high schoolers to do mentoring and tutoring, and then became much larger than that. We realized we needed to reach down to junior high school, and now we're hoping to reach down even to elementary school. But we do everything from mentoring and tutoring to cultural visits to test prep, these kinds of things. And really seen the fruit of it. We're finishing our 6th school year. Valeria graduated from a 4-year university in 3 years, is attending law school this fall. She's come back to serve in the neighborhood for other kids, and we've sent several kids now to 4-year universities, and so we're quite pleased with how they're doing.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
And you're doing a Doctor of Ministry, or you may have just finished that at Northern, I think.
Still writing my thesis paper, so close.
Almost there.
Yeah, almost there.
You've got the look on your face that people have when they're almost there. Tell me something about that program and how it has helped you as you've led in Epic Church.
Yeah, it's really helped me to have new language, to be able to articulate and discern what God is doing. David Fitch has been incredibly helpful in helping someone like myself understand and articulate what I believe, what the gospel is, to try to understand where the church is in relationship to the kingdom of God. I've been able to study under people like Craig Van Gelder and Alan Roxborough, who have helped me immensely to understand that God is working in ordinary people in ordinary places, in our neighborhoods and places of work. And then to go about trying to discern what God is doing and participating in that, and how you form a congregation around that process of discernment. And all the theology behind that, incarnation, Trinitarian thinking. So it's been very helpful, I think, in helping to do ethnography, to better understand our own context, and what leadership might look like within that context.
And it is a doctoral ministry with a focus on missional leadership.
That's right.
How would you define the mission of the church and how the church pursues that mission today?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, 10 years ago, I would have said, "Oh, the mission of the church is this," and I really do believe that it's God's mission, that God has a mission, that God's a missional God, that the gospel certainly includes, in what is central is a point of some form of commitment and decision for Jesus, but the gospel being also much larger than that God is reconciling all things to Christ, and that the Spirit of God is at work amongst us. And so I think any church in any particular location, I think the task is really to discern what God is doing in that particular context, and to understand what our relationship to what God might be doing in any particular place, and what that looks like. And so that's, I think, that's how we participate, that's how we discern what God is doing. I think there's always kind of two conversations going on. That is, what is God doing in Fullerton, for instance, and how might our church participate in that? As well as our community is unique, that God has brought this particular people together with certain gifts and assets as well. And so over the years, for whatever reason, God brought lots of different educators, lots of teachers, lots of professors, seminary folks. And so we've always asked the question, God, what are you doing here with this group of people? He brought, seemed like, an inordinate amount of therapists, for instance. Part of that could be because of our values, but also I think these kinds of people shaped the kind of church we became, lots of artists. So that conversation goes on. What is God doing in our midst, and how might we bless the community? But also the community has assets and needs as well. I think God is doing something in the city to for the city's sake, for the citizens of the city to flourish, for the city to be a great place for people to live, all people to live. And so how might we participate in kind of the healing of the city? And so these conversations, I think, are always going on. It evolves, it changes. But I think you can only do that if you've made a commitment to the place in which you gather and worship and do life. It's essential to discipleship. And I think it's a long-term commitment to a place. And so people wondered if we would ever move because there's some building that is available in some other city, and we've continually said no, that we feel a commitment to this particular place.
Yeah, well, the great Australian dream, and it might be the great American dream as well, is to own your own building.
Yeah.
Both for families and for churches, I think. And there's something about that is always drawing people to it.
Yeah.
How do you engage that question as a congregation and what this might mean for you?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is I realized how expensive buildings were. And maybe because I'm a Gen Xer, but really from day one, we did not assume we would ever own a building. And so even as that discussion came up very early on, even in our first year of existence, so when are we going to own a building? Should we have a building fund? I'm not against buildings. We're in one. We use one. We use buildings. I think they're very helpful. But we didn't think owning one was necessarily essential. And we've just never been able to afford one. And so we've always made do with leasing buildings. I think, and so we're grateful for the places we've been. We're grateful for our home church that has us. We couldn't do what we do without their generosity in extending their facilities to us. On the other hand, maybe a handful of years ago, the city of Fullerton, this is one example of, to your point, the city of Fullerton, the neighbors in these particular low-income neighborhoods, the parents rose up and were very concerned because the school districts could no longer extend summer school programs to the kids because of budget cuts. And so the parents were very concerned about what are we going to do with our kids? They're going to get in trouble, this kind of thing. So they did go to my friend Tommy Nixon, who leads Solidarity, which is the nonprofit in Garnet. And he sits on this civic committee called the Fullerton Collaborative, which the mayor and city council and other folks are part of. So this particular need for the neighborhoods came up. And so Tommy said, well, the collaborative had no idea what it was going to do, but Tommy said, oh, the churches will do something. And there are about 5 of us pastors who would meet with Tommy every month. And so we started together something called Summer of Love Fullerton, which we call Soulful. And so that first summer we had programs in 3 neighborhoods. And we did this for several weeks. We had hundreds of kids and hundreds of volunteers come out. And now it's several years into it, and there's been thousands of kids and volunteers who do everything from education to art to sport in the summer. We do it both on city property and community centers, and now in schools and in neighborhoods. But the interesting thing is that these 4 or 5 churches that began Soulful, none of them had their own building. And I think we were able to do it because we were used to doing ministry in the streets. For instance, Epic's been involved in Garnet for many years. We literally do ministry on the street in literal neighborhoods, in buildings we do not own.
Yeah.
And so I think it was, I really saw that as God's doing, that God was, I think, using these particular churches who I think in Christendom would have said, what's wrong with you? You don't have a building, or you're at a disadvantage because you don't have a building. Yeah. But in terms of mission, I think we had been shaped in such a way where that was no longer an obstacle. That the goal wasn't to bring these kids in the neighborhood to us, but we went into the neighborhoods.
I guess when you have your own buildings too, there's more likely to be tension about, is it in your building, is it in my building? Some of those sorts of things begin to emerge as well.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think it perpetuates the mentality that how do we get people to come to us? How do we have a building, we have rooms to occupy, and there's nothing wrong with that, but, and so how do we, most of the programs end up being on the campus, and maybe that's great depending on where that campus is located. But I think for us, we've benefited immensely our own community from being where we are, but we've also, we've been forced in many ways to be out and about in our city. And so that's kind of how we understand. And for us, it's worked, I think, to our benefit.
What do you think are the greatest challenges that are facing churches today?
Yeah. I can only speak for the Church in North America, and in particular Southern California. I know the statistics are not good in terms of people no longer going to church, and the unaffiliated numbers increasing. And at least from my perspective, I think those numbers, there's a trend that is true. I think in my time as a pastor for 20 years, I've seen a noticeable difference in the way in which people think about church. So even when I was in college many years ago, I think there was still an assumption that could be made that most people go to church. Many people, even if they didn't go to church, realize that church happens on Sundays. But when I walk around our city, most people don't wake up on Sundays and think about church. There's lots going on in our city on Sundays, and those people don't think about church and will never come to church. And yet our institutions, including the church, I think have are built around the assumption that one, the Christian narrative is still alive and well, which I don't think it is. Secondly, that people look to the church. And so the church has been very much marginalized, which is not a bad thing. But I think we need to wake up to the fact that simply because we open the doors and we do church better, we tinker with our worship services to make them more attractive. I think those are all kind of they're misguided efforts. I think we fundamentally have to rethink really the missio Dei of the church. So I think when you're a marginalized community, and I think this is where Asian Americans and other minorities might have some insight for the Anglo Church in North America. So I remember in one of my classes we talked about post-modernity and all the post-Christendom and so forth, and that one of the things the church has to do is to make this shift. And I remember sitting there as an Asian American that I've really never been at the center of American culture. I've never been in the center of kind of white evangelical culture. And as a Japanese American, I've never been in the center of Asian religious culture, which has always been assumed as primarily, for me, Buddhist. to be a Christian, for Japan, for instance, is less than 1%. So I've never known what it's like to live in the center.
Yeah.
And so I've always had that kind of assumption that it just may be some kind of resonance with people who don't quite have a voice, whose perspective is not the majority perspective. And I think the church in Southern California, I think, is beginning to realize that we are a minority voice that needs to earn respect. We have very little authority through office, and so we really need to be intentional about relationship in our communities. It's not that the church is neutral. I think the church is actually there's great disdain for the church, I think, and in many cases rightly so. And so it's an uphill battle, but I think it's an interesting and challenging, but I think harkens this back to the early beginnings of the church as a minority people.
I'll ask you about the shift that's happening in the American church, because there's been a lot of discussion. I think the Pew research suggests that something like 7.5 million Americans stopped going to church between 2012 and 2014. So it seems like a very dramatic exodus from the church. And by one analysis, that shift is a shift from nominalism to just nuns, to not attending anymore. And some have said that what's happening in America is that America is actually headed in the direction of Australia, the UK, Europe, which have very low levels of nominalism compared to America.
Yes.
So one analysis is saying that what's happening now is a sort of a shifting of the deck chairs from nominalism to just spiritual but not religious. But I wonder whether actually that is the whole picture, or whether there actually is an exodus of people who were once very passionate about faith but are now questioning the relevance, the integrity of the church. I'm left a bit puzzled. Is this really just an exodus of those who are nominal, or is there something else that's going on and the church has to look at itself much more closely? I don't know if you have a sense about this.
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest. We've seen both. We've seen people leave our church, for instance, who I think are trying to, practice their faith without being part of a larger congregation. I think they're spiritual but not religious type of folks. And then I've just seen people who, very much full participation within congregation who've just left. There is a way. I think at least the people I know, there is something to do with kind of this hypermobility and upward mobility, wanderlust that I think is very typical of our culture, kind of a transience, kind of an individualism even, that where we believe in some ways to commit ourselves to a particular people or a particular place seems to be limiting of our freedom. And so I see more and more people, these kind of nominal, once committed people become more nominal and then basically just leave to pursue other things. Quite disconnected from any particular community, moving from place to place, kind of pursuing their interests, kind of being unencumbered in a sense. So I do see those people. And I think that's maybe a majority of the people that I see. And so to be the kind of church that we are, to call people to make a long-term commitment to community, to that kind of discipleship over a long period of time in a particular place, even to call people when they're able to actually consider moving into our city, feels very countercultural, feels very against the grain.
Yeah.
I think it's very challenging. But I'm very encouraged on the other end, other side, to see more and more people not only consider that, but to actually do that. But it does feel very countercultural. And so I see those two dynamics really kind of at play, at least in our context.
It's interesting because you hear people say things like staying is the new going, you know, and people rediscovering neighbourhood and rediscovering location. But I do wonder sometimes, and being a local pastor, you're sort of at the coalface of this, I wonder sometimes whether people like the idea of neighbourhood. They like the sort of the notion of staying is the new going until they perceive that it limits their freedoms.
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah. Well, when I became a Christian, interesting was that the default was to stay home. So my peers, we assumed we'd go to college, work near home. You know, we were all afraid that if we prayed earnestly enough, that God was going to send us to Australia, Africa, right? And then when we started Epic, I had noticed that it had completely flipped on its head, that God forbid that we would stay home. That I can't wait to move out and go to college back east, for instance, or once I get out of college, I'm going to travel the world and live some other place, and that's just the norm. And so people assume that they're going to live somewhere else, and if there's no other good options, they'll stay home. Yeah, and so maybe the last, 5-10 years, I think there is a movement towards particularity and place. Now, again, that creates all kinds of other issues of gentrification. When you say that, I think, at least in Southern California, that means specific kinds of places.
Yeah.
High density, good restaurants, good shopping, hip people. So even within that, I think there is a way in which only wealthy, upwardly mobile, educated people have those kinds of choices to live in those kinds of places. But yes, there is a movement to locality, artisanal kind of movements, which I think can be really great things. Yeah.
Kevin Doyle, thank you for joining us.
Yeah,
at
thanks
the
for
Global
having
Church
me.
Project.
Yeah, I love it.
The Global Church Project is located at www.theglobalchurchproject.com. On our website, you'll find a wide range of interviews and resources for colleges, universities, and churches. I look forward to your company next time. From me, goodbye.